The call from the dark. They said he had gone silent. That Nnamdi Kanu, the man they labeled a separatist and extremist, had vanished behind thick cement walls in Abuja. No press, no trial, no sunlight. But then one night in June, the security system at the detention facility froze. Exactly 3 minutes, no explanation. And then it came, a raw audio file, no national broadcast, no official statement, just a voice cracked but steady, echoing across Telegram. I was never tried. I was never afraid. They locked me up, not because I was dangerous, but because I spoke the truth. The recording was tagged. Traoré was right 3 words. One resistance, and a whole continent began to listen. For 48 hours, Nigeria said nothing. No press briefing, no ministerial response. Only silence, thick strategic trembling. But across the continent, the silence began to crack. In Aba, elders gathered by candlelight, not to pray, but to listen. In Cape Town, murals began appearing overnight. Stenciled faces of a man with salt-white hair and the words, "He spoke so we could breathe." And in London, outside the Nigerian High Commission, a woman held up her phone. On it, the audio played again and again. No speeches, just Kanu's voice. The BBC Igbo team worked quietly, feverishly. Within 24 hours, their analysis confirmed it. The voice was real. The speaker was Nnamdi Kanu. And with that confirmation, something shifted. Not in government halls, but in living rooms, in WhatsApp groups, in markets and mosques and back streets from Accra to Atlanta. If he's speaking, one grandmother in Enugu whispered, then they haven't broken him. But it wasn't just the voice, it was what the voice reminded people of. A man taken from Kenya, rendered illegally, held for almost 2 years without trial. Nigeria claimed it was protecting unity, but unity built on fear is not unity. It is a cage, and that cage was beginning to rust. The numbers spoke louder than any government denial. Over 20% of Nigeria's population are Igbo, yet they remain underrepresented in the judiciary, in federal appointments and national discourse. In 2022 alone, 14 journalists were detained for covering pro-Biafra protests. None of them were charged. Most were released only after international pressure. According to Amnesty International, over 50 IPOB supporters have disappeared since 2020. Some were found in mass graves. Others were never found at all. And now, the man they called the instigator had spoken. On Caribbean radio, the diaspora roared to life. From Kingston to Port of Spain, Igbo descendants shared stories their parents never dared tell, of villages burned, of languages erased, of maps drawn without asking. At a vigil in Jamaica, a girl barely 20 stood on a plastic chair and shouted Nigeria didn't just silence Kanu, they tried to silence history. And now we remember. And still Abuja remained silent. But silence can be louder than a scream, because silence is a choice. And every hour Nigeria said nothing, Africa heard everything. It was not a trending topic anymore. It was a wound, fresh, bleeding, unhealed. And it wasn't about Biafra, or politics, or borders. It was about truth, about what it costs, and about who is brave enough to carry it. Emotional refrain. They took him, they hid him, but they forgot. We remember his voice, soft viewer prompt. Have you ever been told your truth was too dangerous to speak? If so, you are not alone. The photo was blurry, grainy like something from a Cold War dossier. But it was real. In the center, Donald J. Trump, suit slightly unbuttoned, eyebrows furrowed. Across from him, Ibrahim Traoré, younger stone-faced eyes like tempered steel. Between them nothing, no documents, no podiums, just the flicker of candlelight. And beneath the photo the words, "If he falls, we all do." No press release followed, no official statement, but the image spread like wildfire, from Johannesburg to Jacksonville. People asked, what was Traoré doing with Trump? And more curiously, why was Trump asking about a prisoner in Nigeria? The answer, like the photo, was shadowed, but some say it began weeks earlier, when Traoré, in a private audience in Ouagadougou, spoke 3 simple words to a visiting American delegation: let Kanu speak. Those 3 words reached Mar-a-Lago, and suddenly the silence around Kanu was no longer just a Nigerian issue. It was an African one and a global one. Donald Trump had never been known for championing African voices, but here he was allegedly pressing Nigeria, a key U.S. partner, about a man they refused to put on trial. At a conservative gathering in Florida, Trump made a cryptic remark: "There's a man, they won't let him talk, maybe because he knows too much, no name, no country." But the room froze, and Africa paid attention. In private circles, diplomatic cables whispered of an unlikely alliance. Traoré, the young revolutionary soldier president of Burkina Faso, and Trump, the controversial businessman turned statesman, were said to have exchanged more than just words. Traoré allegedly shared confidential documents, proof that Kanu's arrest in Kenya violated every protocol of international law, proof that he had been held without medical care, without sunlight, without a trial date, proof that what was happening was not justice. Trump, ever the tactician, saw the opportunity, not just to make a statement, but to fracture the Western narrative about Africa. "You call them partners," he said privately, "but you silence their voices. That's not partnership, that's panic." The reaction was nuclear. Nigerian officials scrambled to deny any foreign pressure, but news agencies began asking harder questions. Why hadn't Kanu been seen in court? Why was the UN Human Rights Council suddenly preparing a statement? And most curiously, why was Burkina Faso offering to send observers to the next Nigerian judicial session? Inside Nigeria, confusion reigned. State media ran editorials denouncing foreign interference, but underground radio stations played Kanu's audio on loop, sandwiched between Afrobeats and resistance poetry. "He may be behind bars," one announcer said, "but his words, they walk free." Traoré remained silent, but silence in his case was not absence. It was strategy, and it was working. Across Africa, something began to shift. Not just sympathy, not just outrage, but a question if even Trump can ask about Kanu. Why are we afraid to audience question if the person you once criticized turned out to be the only one brave enough to speak for justice? Would you stay silent, or would you stand beside them? Symbolic echo. They called Sankara a madman. They called Kanu a traitor, but history has a strange way of restoring dignity to those the present tries to erase. Visual cue for voiceover break. A map of Africa fades in, every country turning red. Then slowly flickers of light begin appearing, not from capitals, but from the margins, from the places they thought were too poor to speak. He hadn't been seen in public for 631 days. No photographs, no videos, no courtroom sketches, just whispers, rumors, silence. Then without warning he walked in, not dragged, not bent, but standing, straight, tall, with the quiet fire of a man who had not been broken, only tempered. The courtroom was smaller than expected. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. A single fan turned slowly in the heat, as if unsure if it should dare move. The judge looked nervous. The prosecutors avoided his eyes. The gallery held its breath. Nnamdi Kanu stood between 2 guards, his white tunic loose hands folded calmly. His hair was thinner, his face sharper, but his voice, when he finally spoke, had not lost an inch of power. "I do not stand here to plead. I stand because they could not silence me, and because silence is the language of the enslaved." People outside the courthouse wept. They were not supporters, not all of them. Some had come out of curiosity, others because they remembered Biafra only as a ghost whispered in their grandparents' fear. But when they heard Kanu speak, the ghost became flesh. History stood upright, and it demanded to be seen. Inside the courtroom, the questions came. Why was there no formal charge for nearly 2 years? Why had he been denied access to medical care? Why had the Nigerian government failed to present a legal basis for his forced transfer from Kenya? The answers never came, just legal evasions, technicalities, and hollow phrases like national security. But in the silence that followed, Kanu spoke again. I am not your enemy, I am your mirror. What you do to me, you do to your own conscience. International media, long asleep on the issue, woke up. CNN ran a segment. Not prime time, not yet. But it was a beginning. Al Jazeera sent a crew to Onitsha. The BBC ran a special with voice actors reading his leaked letters. Suddenly the world heard the name Nnamdi Kanu again. Not as a terrorist, not as a troublemaker, but as a man who had survived a system designed to erase him. In Paris, a protest banner read, "You gave France your uranium, now give Nigeria her justice." In South Africa, university students formed a coalition called Voices Beyond Bars. In Ghana, a mural appeared overnight, a face painted in red, black, and green. Underneath it, he is not the last. He is just the first to return. And yet within Nigeria, the government held the line. A new media directive banned further coverage of the trial. Police raided community radio stations in Imo State. Mobile data was cut in selected Igbo-dominant areas. But the harder they tried to bury his voice, the more it multiplied. Clips of Kanu's words were now TikTok reels. Church choirs turned his quotes into spoken-word hymns. Children recited his courtroom declaration as poetry in morning assemblies. I am not asking for power. I am asking for presence. For every child buried without a name. For every voice unheard because it was inconvenient. Traoré once again said nothing publicly. But 3 things happened in the same week. Burkina Faso released a formal statement urging Pan-African accountability. Its foreign minister met quietly with the UN human rights delegation. A Pan-African youth conference in Ouagadougou opened with a moment of silence, not for a president, not for a celebrity, but for a prisoner. Meanwhile, something was brewing in the prison. Guards reported a change. Inmates, some who barely spoke. Igbo began fasting. A group of cellmates refused food for 2 days. They wrote his name in chalk on the wall. Kanu spoke Tsar's courage. One of them, a former street vendor, later told a journalist, "He spoke like the ones my grandmother used to sing about. Not like a politician, like a prophet, who didn't want followers, only witnesses." What Nigeria feared most was happening. Kanu was no longer just a man. He was becoming a symbol, a wound that refused to scar over quietly. They called it the rebellion without fire. No weapons, no marches, just words, repeated, shared, etched into school desks, whispered in prison corridors, chanted in mosques after prayer. Let him speak, let him breathe, let us be heard. And then came the twist. A judge, young, unassuming, ordered that Kanu be moved to a medical facility for evaluation. It was not full freedom, not even close, but it was oxygen. And with oxygen comes fire. They thought the cell would kill his spirit, but the silence only made it louder. Have you ever known a moment where the world tried to erase you, but your truth refused to die? If you have, you already understand him. The courtroom victory was small, temporary, but across Africa it cracked something open. For years many had whispered, but now they began to speak. In Kenya, a coalition of lawyers demanded an inquiry into how Nnamdi Kanu was removed from their soil. In Senegal, a rapper interrupted his own concert to shout, "We are not silent, we are under siege." In Nigeria, the youth, tired, hungry, ignored, began painting murals with only one phrase, "We hear him." And in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré broke his silence. Standing before a crowd of students in Ouagadougou, he said, This is no longer about Kanu. This is about who gets to write our story. The crowd didn't cheer, they stood still, the weight of his words sinking in, because everyone knew. Africa had been written about, but rarely by itself. Then came the backlash. 5 African nations, under pressure from Western allies, released a joint statement condemning foreign interference in judicial matters. They didn't name Traoré. They didn't have to. The message was clear: stay in your lane. Let Nigeria handle Nigeria. But that was the old Africa speaking, the Africa of silence, the Africa of chains with golden locks. In Lagos, police cracked down on university gatherings. 2 students were arrested for wearing shirts that read, "His voice is our verdict." In Port Harcourt, a journalist was taken from his home. No warrant, no charges. His only crime, publishing a piece titled, "Nigeria vs. Kanu, the Trial That Feared Its Own Echo." But no matter how hard they tried, the words spread. A video leaked from inside Kuje prison. A choir of men, dozens of them chanting, "Africa is not poor. Africa is silenced. And now we break the chains with our tongues." The footage was grainy, the audio raw, but it pierced deeper than any polished speech. In Jamaica, schoolchildren studied the Biafra conflict for the first time. In Canada, a Nigerian diaspora group launched a documentary, "Kanu, the Trial We Never Saw." On social media, a new movement bloomed. African voices matter, not a trend, a rallying cry. If we let one voice disappear, one user tweeted, "We erase our future in slow motion." Then, the shift. A memo leaked from within the Nigerian Ministry of Justice. It warned of growing international liabilities if Kanu's case was not resolved transparently. Foreign investors were nervous. NGOs pulled out of development partnerships. Tourism projections dropped. The economy felt the tremble of one man's voice. Traoré moved again, this time diplomatically. Burkina Faso offered to host a Pan-African mediation forum, inviting nations to discuss sovereignty and justice in the Age of Awakening. 6 nations agreed, 3 declined. Nigeria stayed silent. But silence once again was not strength, it was surrender. Meanwhile, something stranger happened. The youth stopped waiting for governments. They created their own tribunals. In Ghana, a group of law students held a people's court. They read out Kanu's rights. They analyzed his detainment. They declared this court finds the silence of African leadership complicit. Thousands watched it online, not because it was legally binding, but because it felt morally urgent. Across borders, artists began to rebel. In Malawi, a singer released a track called "Voice Under Lock." In Nigeria, street poets began performing under bridges, quoting Kanu's trial speech. In Soweto, a mural appeared on the wall of an abandoned church. They buried him in a cell, but he rose in our mouths. It was not revolution with guns. It was revolution with memory, and memory once awakened doesn't go back to sleep. The African Union convened a closed-door meeting. For the first time in over a decade, Kanu's name was spoken inside those walls. A delegate from Namibia said, "We have spent years asking for aid, but we forgot to ask who speaks for our people." Voiceover moment. The war was no longer about geography, it was about narrative. Who gets to name a terrorist? Who decides what justice looks like? And what happens when the people no longer wait for permission to feel outraged? But just as the movement rose, a new threat emerged. Cyber attacks hit independent media sites in Nigeria. Pages covering the Kanu trial were taken down. WhatsApp groups disappeared overnight. A pro-Kanu journalist's car was set ablaze. It became clear this wasn't just a legal case. It was a digital war, a spiritual war, a cultural one, and yet, the people kept speaking, not in crowds, not with flags, but in kitchens, in dorm rooms, in taxis. One man's voice had become everyone's whisper, and whispers, when repeated enough, become thunder. Refrain for narration pause. They tried to bury the idea, But ideas grow in the dark. Soft viewer prompt. Have you ever seen a system so afraid of one voice that it burned books, silenced music, and erased memory to stop it? If so, you've seen colonialism with a new face. They called him many things: a traitor, a radical, a man who wanted to divide, but they forgot that behind every label there is a story, and stories, when told with courage, have a way of outliving the prisons built to silence them. Nnamdi Kanu did not escape. He did not win a courtroom war. He did not sign treaties or take oaths of power. All he did was speak, and for that he shook a continent. He reminded us that justice delayed isn't just denied, it's designed that way. That silence enforced by fear is louder than any scream. That a voice, when stripped of microphones and headlines, becomes raw, and raw truth is unforgettable. This wasn't just a Nigerian story, it was an African one. It asked every citizen, what does freedom sound like? And more importantly, what does it cost? We saw it cost him family, health, time, and nearly his name. But in losing those things, he gave us something rarer, a mirror, not of a man, but of a moment. A moment when Africa remembered that to be sovereign means to speak for yourself. Not through ambassadors, not through charities, not through borrowed words, but in your own tongue, in your own courts, with your own courage. This story is not over. There will be more silence, more attempts to delete, distort, disappear. But now, we've heard the voice, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Final voiceover note. They said he was alone, but look again. He was never alone. He was just the first to speak. Soft, powerful call to action. If you believe that Africa's future belongs to those brave enough to speak, if you believe that silence is not peace and erasure is not unity, then type in the comments, New Africa, because this isn't just a video, this is a call, and every call deserves an answer. The voice that broke Africa's silence. They said he vanished. Nnamdi Kanu, the man they called a separatist, was hidden in a Nigerian cell for nearly 2 years, without trial, without daylight, without justice. Then one night the silence cracked. A mysterious audio leaked. His voice, scarred, but steady, declared, "I was never tried. I was never afraid. They locked me up, not because I was dangerous, but because I spoke the truth." 3 words ended the message. Traoré was right. Africa stopped. For 48 hours, Nigeria offered no comment. But across the continent, candles were lit, murals painted, old fears awoken. In Jamaica, youth cried out. They didn't just silence Kanu, they silenced history. In Enugu, whispers turned into certainty. They haven't broken him. It wasn't just about Biafra anymore. It was about what truth costs in a land built on fear. Amnesty reports told the rest. Dozens of journalists, jailed activists disappeared, and a whole people, Igbo, denied equal voice in the nation that claims them. And now the man they feared most had spoken. What followed wasn't revolution with guns, but revolution through memory. And it came with an unlikely twist: Donald Trump. A photo leaked showing him with Ibrahim Traoré. Rumors swirled. Traoré had whispered 3 words to America: let Kanu speak. Trump hinted at a man they won't let talk, maybe because he knows too much. Suddenly, Kanu's name spread not as a terrorist, but as a survivor. International media stirred. Churches sang his words. Children recited his speeches. In Burkina Faso, Traoré remained silent strategically, but made moves, human rights meetings, Pan-African forums, symbolic gestures. His silence wasn't absence, it was leadership. Kanu finally appeared in court. After 631 days, he stood not begging, but defiant. I do not plead. I speak because silence is slavery. The courtroom trembled. Outside, people wept, not because they agreed, but because they remembered. The state tried again to erase him. Media blackouts, arrests, raids. But every suppression became a spark. TikTok's graffiti poetry in prisons. A whisper became thunder. Then the turning point, a young judge ordered Kanu moved to a medical facility. Just oxygen, but with oxygen comes fire. Across Africa, the voice kept rising. From Kenya to Senegal, people asked, "Why are we silent if even Trump is not?" Ghanaian students held symbolic trials. Artists rebelled. Journalists defied bans. A movement bloomed where African voices matter. Nigeria faced economic tremors. Investors pulled back. The African Union convened. For the first time in years, Kanu's name was spoken in Pan-African diplomacy, not as a rebel, but as a question of justice. Then came the digital war. Sites were hacked, groups deleted, journalists threatened. But the story didn't die. It moved into kitchens, taxis, dorms. One prisoner said he spoke like the men my grandmother sang of. Not a politician, a prophet. They called it the rebellion without fire. No armies, no borders, just memory. And memory, once awake, doesn't go back to sleep. Nnamdi Kanu didn't escape. He didn't win a court battle. He didn't hold power. He spoke. And that shook a continent. His voice became a mirror reflecting Africa's silence, fear, and longing. It asked, "What does freedom cost? And who writes our story?" Traoré answered, "This is no longer about Kanu. It's about who tells our truth. If you believe silence is not peace and erasure is not unity, type in the comments, New Africa. Because this was never just a story. It was a call. And now, it needs an answer." As the weeks passed, the courtroom decision began to ripple far beyond Nigeria. It wasn't just a legal step, it was symbolic oxygen for a continent gasping for justice. In cities like Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Dakar, student groups formed spontaneous reading circles, analyzing Kanu's words as though they were sacred texts. His defiance, quiet but searing, was becoming a curriculum for African consciousness. In South Africa, murals of Kanu's face appeared beside those of Steve Biko. In Ghana, the phrase, "He spoke so we could breathe," became a street chant echoing through Accra's markets. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré made his boldest move, yet he invited every African youth union to a conference titled "Voices That Built Us." He did not name Kanu. He didn't need to. Instead, Traoré spoke of silence as a weapon, of memory as resistance, and of the responsibility of the living to carry the unfinished stories of the fallen. Africa will not rise through aid, he told a packed stadium. Africa will rise through truth, even the kind that burns. That truth was starting to burn deeply in the corridors of power. In Abuja, Nigerian officials scrambled. Foreign embassies requested updates. The World Court hinted at an investigation, and international donors quietly paused funding pipelines, citing human rights inconsistencies. But inside Nigeria, the battle was far from over. Community stations were shut down. Internet access slowed in Igbo-dominant states. Writers went missing. Activists were labeled terrorists overnight, yet the voice refused to vanish. A leaked recording from inside Kuje prison showed something extraordinary. Dozens of inmates chanting, "Africa is not poor. Africa is silenced." The rawness of it, their voices against concrete walls, became a viral pulse. No mainstream network aired it, but millions saw it, shared it, wept to it. In Cameroon, a journalist declared on live radio, "This is not just about Kanu. This is about the soul of African justice." And in Somalia, a teacher told her class, "You do not need permission to be remembered." But just as the movement gathered force, the counterstrike escalated. Cyber attacks crippled diaspora media sites. WhatsApp groups disappeared overnight. A popular pro-Kanu Twitter page was hacked and replaced with pornography. The signal was clear erasure by overload. Still, it did not work. Why? Because the movement had mutated. It no longer depended on names or faces. It had become decentralized, like water, seeping into every crack of the African experience. In markets, people whispered Kanu's courtroom, quote, like prophecy. In churches, choirs sang rewritten hymns with lines like, "We were not born to beg for breath." In homes, elders who once feared to speak about Biafra now told their grandchildren everything. Even African celebrities, long silent, began to weigh in. In a surprise award show speech, a Nigerian singer held up a white tunic and simply said, "This is not fashion, this is defiance." The crowd rose in silence, fists raised. Meanwhile, Traoré played the long game. He quietly pushed for a Pan-African Legal Review Council meant to question how international law is applied or ignored when African dissidents are involved. The West called it provocative, the youth called it finally, and the signal grew stronger. At a UN Human Rights Forum, Burkina Faso's envoy stated, "You cannot bury voices in cells and call it peace. You cannot deny trials and speak of democracy." Global media started calling this moment the second wind of African memory, and at its center, still detained, still technically uncharged, stood Nnamdi Kanu. His silence, now voluntary, was strategic. Each time the Nigerian government delayed his next hearing, more voices rose. Each time they denied him access to medicine, the global campaign for his release intensified. The longer they held him, the more he became everyone. A street vendor in Benin put it best: he is no longer one man. He is what happens when truth survives isolation. Then came the day that changed everything. A video clearly smuggled showed Kanu addressing a group of fellow inmates in a courtyard. He spoke only once: "The cell is not the punishment. Forgetting who you are is." That single clip reignited every fire. The world saw a man unbroken, not asking for power but presence, not seeking vengeance but memory. Universities across Africa began offering elective courses on narratives of silencing. The University of Dakar offered the first scholarship named after Kanu. In Ethiopia, a student radio station opened with the words, "This broadcast is free because someone once dared to speak." And still, the Nigerian government remained locked in its own silence. A silence that now looked less like strength and more like fear. The final blow came not from protest, not from press, but from poetry. A child in Uganda, no older than 11, stood at a school recital and recited this. They took his name and tried to burn it, but names are seeds in thirsty soil. The crowd, mostly parents, rose, not in applause but in awe, because they knew this wasn't just about Nigeria anymore. This was a war for Africa's memory, and it was no longer being fought with guns, but with voice. By early autumn, the narrative had broken out of Africa. What began as whispers from a prison cell in Nigeria had reached parliaments in Europe, podcasts in Latin America, protests in Toronto and Melbourne. The world, once indifferent, now asked the same question: why was Nnamdi Kanu never tried? And more dangerously for Nigeria's establishment, what else are they hiding? International lawyers began filing amicus briefs to the African Court on Human and People's Rights. A coalition of human rights organizations released a scathing report titled, "Justice Deferred is Justice Denied," the Kanu Files, listing over 200 violations of due process. European think tanks spoke of soft apartheid within Nigeria's federal structure. The language was changing. The stakes were global. But inside Nigeria, the repression worsened. A high school teacher in Aba was arrested for screening Kanu's speech during civic studies. In Imo State, a pastor was detained mid-sermon for quoting his courtroom line, "I am your mirror." No charge, no record, just silence. Again, and yet every attempt to silence echoed louder, because this time Africa was not looking away. In Burkina Faso, a new school mural depicted Kanu, with his mouth stitched shut, standing between Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. The message below read, "They killed their bodies. You're trying to kill his voice, but we are the voice now." President Ibrahim Traoré did not issue press conferences. He didn't need to. His government's cultural ministry quietly commissioned a traveling exhibition called Forgotten Trials. It featured poetry court transcripts and artwork from political prisoners across Africa. Kanu's segment was the largest, and in a major symbolic gesture, the capital's central plaza, formerly named after a French general, was renamed Place de la Vérité, the Square of Truth. That same week, two things happened that turned the tide irreversibly. First, a document leaked from ECOWAS, a classified memo warning that if Nigeria did not resolve the Kanu case with transparency and regional respect, it could trigger a wave of secessionist sentiment not only in the East, but across Africa's disillusioned fault lines. Second, Kanu's legal team filed an official complaint to the International Criminal Court, citing arbitrary detention and psychological torture. The ICC acknowledged receipt. And just like that, the trial Nigeria feared had gone international. But perhaps the most powerful blow came not from courts or councils, but from music. A global African anthem emerged titled His Voice, Our Verdict, featuring artists from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Jamaica. The chorus, they stole his trial, but not his name. They jailed his truth, but we speak the flame. It went viral in 38 countries, played on subways in London, sung at protests in Nairobi, whispered by schoolchildren in Port-au-Prince. Meanwhile, the Nigerian state kept insisting he is not a symbol. He is a threat to national unity. But unity without justice is not peace, and peace without voice is not freedom. And the youth knew it. In Ibadan, a group of engineering students coded an AI chatbot that answered only in quotes from African freedom fighters Sankara Fanon, and now Kanu. In Lagos, young mothers named their sons Nnamdi Kanu, short for Nnamdi Kanu's echo. Even elders began to shift. A retired general appeared on a local talk show and confessed, "We were told to keep him buried, but now even I hear his voice in my sleep." We did not defeat him. We merely postponed his generation. That generation was now on fire. Across campuses in Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa, law students held mock tribunals. Not symbolic, not theatrical, but meticulous. Line by line, they read his detention order, compared it to the Nigerian constitution and international treaties. Their unanimous verdict, the law was broken, and silence was the accomplice. Then came the most haunting act of resistance yet. On October 15th, at exactly midnight, candles were lit across over 70 African cities. No slogans, no speeches, just a moment of synchronized silence. For 1 minute, a continent paused to honor a man still behind bars because he dared to speak. Satellite images caught at flickers of light from Accra to Asmara, from Goma to Gaborone. A single phrase trended worldwide. Africa remembers. The Nigerian government's response was predictable. Denial, suppression, a ban on candlelight vigils. But even soldiers, when asked to remove the candles, simply stepped back. One officer was overheard saying, "My daughter lit that. I'm not putting it out." At this point, Ibrahim Traoré could have claimed leadership. He could have taken the spotlight. He didn't. Instead, he funded scholarships for former detainees. He launched a Justice in the Shadows initiative, documenting every political